In the sprawling suburbs of Ferguson, Missouri, where modest ranch houses line quiet streets and neighbors wave politely from their driveways, there lived a man who seemed utterly unremarkable. He was soft-spoken, helpful even, the kind of person who would mow your lawn without being asked and show you how to use your hedge trimmer. His neighbors knew him by his childhood nickname, Toby, and remembered him as a pleasant boy with what one described as a soft heart. But what they didn't know, what no one could have imagined, was that behind the walls of his ordinary home, this unremarkable man was systematically torturing and murdering women, recording their final moments with the clinical detachment of a scientist documenting an experiment. His name was Maury Travis, and his story is one of the most chilling reminders that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it wears the mask of the neighbor next door, the quiet waiter who brings your coffee, the man who blends so seamlessly into the fabric of suburban life that he becomes invisible. But invisibility, as Travis would discover, can be both a weapon and a weakness. Born on October 25th, 1965, in St. Louis, Missouri, Maury Travis entered the world as part of what appeared to be an ordinary American family. His parents, Sandra and Michael Travis, lived in the Carr Square public housing complex just northwest of downtown St. Louis, a neighborhood where families struggled to get by, but maintained their dignity and dreams for something better. Young Maury attended St. Louis public schools, walking the same hallways and sitting in the same classrooms as thousands of other children who would grow up to live normal, productive lives. When Travis was 10 years old, his family moved to Ferguson, Missouri, settling into a simple, ranch-style house that would later become synonymous with unspeakable horrors. The move represented upward mobility for the Travis family, a step toward the American dream of homeownership and suburban stability. But even then, there were cracks in the foundation. In 1978, when Maury was 13, his parents divorced, fracturing the family structure that had provided whatever stability existed in his young life. Yet to those who knew him during these formative years, Travis showed few signs of the monster he would become. A neighbor in Ferguson remembered him as Toby, a quiet, respectful boy who sometimes mowed her lawn without being asked and took the time to show her how to use an electric hedge trimmer. She described him as having a soft heart, a characterization that would prove tragically ironic given the path his life would take. But perhaps that soft heart was part of the problem, vulnerable to hardening under pressures that remained invisible to the outside world. The truth is that very few people remembered Travis at all. Unlike many serial killers whose childhoods are marked by obvious red flags, dramatic incidents of abuse, or early signs of violence, Travis seemed to slip through life almost unnoticed. His teachers barely recalled him, classmates had no strong memories of him, and even longtime neighbors admitted they had virtually no recollection of the boy. This quality of being forgettable, of existing in the spaces between other people's attention, would become both his shield and his defining characteristic. As Travis moved through adolescence and into adulthood, this pattern of invisibility continued. He enrolled at Ferguson Junior High School in 1981 as a ninth grader, but his academic career was unremarkable. What is known is that he eventually found work as a waiter in local hotels, a job that required him to be pleasant, accommodating, and largely invisible to the guests he served. It was honest work, the kind of job that millions of Americans depend on to make a living. But for Travis, it may have also served as a form of camouflage, allowing him to observe human behavior while remaining essentially unseen. But beneath the surface of this ordinary life, something darker was taking root. Travis developed a serious drug addiction, particularly to crack cocaine, a substance that would increasingly control his actions and choices. The drug habit led him down a path of petty crime, culminating in 1989 when he was convicted of armed robbery. He served time in prison, experiencing the dehumanizing world of incarceration that strips away whatever illusions a person might have about their place in society. Upon his release, Travis was placed on parole, officially monitored by the state, but in reality left largely to his own devices as long as he checked in regularly and stayed out of obvious trouble. He returned to work as a waiter, this time at a restaurant in Chesterfield, Missouri, serving customers who saw him as nothing more than a face that brought their food and refilled their drinks. To the outside world, he appeared to be a success story of rehabilitation, a man who had paid his debt to society and was now living a quiet, law-abiding life. But prison had not rehabilitated Maury Travis. If anything, it had taught him valuable lessons about power, control, and the importance of not getting caught. He had learned to navigate systems, to appear compliant while harboring his own agenda, and perhaps most importantly, he had been exposed to a level of human brutality that normalized violence in ways his suburban upbringing never could. It was during this period, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, that Travis began his transformation from petty criminal to something far more sinister. He started frequenting a strip of North Broadway in St. Louis known as the Stroll, an area riddled with crack houses, prostitution, and the kind of human desperation that makes people vulnerable to predators. This was not the respectable world of Ferguson suburbs, where Travis maintained his public persona, but a shadow realm where society's most marginalized citizens struggled to survive. The women who worked the Stroll were exactly the kind of victims Travis was looking for: vulnerable, isolated, often struggling with addiction, and frequently estranged from families who might notice if they disappeared. Many were mothers who had lost custody of their children, women whose lives had spiraled downward in ways that made them essentially invisible to mainstream society. To most people, they were statistics, cautionary tales, problems to be solved or ignored. To Travis, they were opportunities. His method was carefully calculated. He would approach these women in his various vehicles, a white Corvette, sometimes a van, presenting himself as just another customer in a transaction that was sadly routine for them. He offered money, drugs, perhaps just a warm place to spend some time. What he was really offering was a trap, but wrapped in the kind of ordinary interaction that these women had experienced hundreds of times before. Travis would drive his victims to his ranch-style house in Ferguson, the same home where he had lived as that soft-hearted boy named Toby. But the basement of that house had been transformed into something unimaginable. Travis had constructed what investigators would later describe as a torture chamber, complete with restraints, torture devices, and most chillingly, video equipment to record what happened there. The details of what occurred in that basement are almost too disturbing to comprehend. Travis would bind his victims to wooden support beams using ropes and handcuffs to render them completely helpless. He would cover their eyes with duct tape, removing their ability to see what was happening to them while ensuring they could hear every word he spoke. And Travis talked constantly during these sessions, taunting his victims, degrading them, and expressing his contempt for their life choices. In one recorded exchange that police later discovered, Travis forced a victim to speak to her children through the camera. "You want to say something to your kids?" he asked. When the terrified woman whispered, "I'm sorry," Travis responded with cold cruelty. "Who's raising your kids?" "You ain't raising nothing. You over here on your back smoking crack. You ain't going home tomorrow. I'm keeping you about a week. Is that all right?" Travis forced his victims to participate in bizarre rituals, making them dance in white clothes or wear blackened sunglasses so they couldn't see. He made them declare their subservience, forcing one woman to repeat, "You are the master. It pleases me to serve you," until he was satisfied with her delivery. When she didn't say it clearly enough, he would scream at her to say it clearer. All of this was captured on video, creating a record of human suffering that served both as trophies and as psychological reinforcement for Travis's sense of power and control. Eventually, when Travis tired of the psychological torture, he would kill his victims. Sometimes, he used strangulation, wrapping belts around their necks and pulling until they went limp. Other times, he employed different methods, but the result was always the same. These women, who had once been daughters, mothers, sisters, people with hopes and dreams and human connections, became nothing more than bodies to be disposed of. Travis dumped his victims' remains in remote areas around St. Louis, often in East Street, Louis, and West Alton, Missouri. He showed no more care for their bodies than someone might show for garbage, leaving them in fields, ditches, and wooded areas where they might remain undiscovered for months or years. Between 2000 and 2002, the skeletal remains of women began appearing with disturbing regularity, but police initially had no reason to connect these scattered discoveries to a single killer. The true scope of Travis's crimes might never have been discovered if not for his own ego and need for recognition. Despite his lifelong pattern of invisibility, Travis apparently craved acknowledgement for his work. In May 2002, he sent an anonymous letter to Bill Smith, a reporter for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, who had been covering the murders of local women. The letter was both a taunt and a confession, claiming credit for multiple murders and including directions to the body of one victim. "Dear Bill," the letter began, "nice sob story about Teresa Wilson. Write a good one about Janet, too. Here's a map to number 17. The map was computer-generated, created using a web-based mapping service, and showed the location where investigators would indeed find human remains. But Travis had made a critical error. In his desire to be recognized for his crimes, he had forgotten that the digital age leaves traces of everything. When investigators examined the map, they discovered it had been created using Expedia.com's mapping service. Working with Microsoft, FBI agents were able to trace the map to a specific IP address that had accessed the service on the evening of May 20th, 2002. That IP address belonged to a single customer, Maury Travis of Ferguson, Missouri. On the morning of June 7th, 2002, Detective Sergeant Tim Sachs of the St. Louis Metropolitan Police Department, accompanied by FBI agents, knocked on the door of Travis's ranch house. Travis answered the door in his boxer shorts, clearly irritated at being awakened so early. "It's 7 o'clock in the morning," were the first words out of his mouth, according to Detective Sachs. Travis was not in a good mood, but he agreed to come to police headquarters for questioning. At the police station, Travis maintained his composure initially, even displaying a kind of arrogant confidence. When detectives showed him photographs of murdered women, he claimed not to recognize any of them. But when they told him the women had been murdered, Travis went quiet. He had never been told these women were dead, yet he had shown no surprise at the news. Minutes later, he shocked investigators by offering to lead them to another body in East St. Louis. But as they drove toward the location, Travis apparently realized he was revealing too much. Near the Poplar Street Bridge on Interstate 64, he changed his mind and told police to take him back to jail. He had not confessed to anything specific, but his behavior was creating its own form of evidence. Back at headquarters, Travis asked for a soda, which detectives provided. After finishing his drink, he casually tossed the can away, not realizing he was providing investigators with a DNA sample that would ultimately link him definitively to multiple murders. The genetic material on that can would match DNA evidence recovered from several victims, providing the scientific proof needed to establish Travis as their killer. But the most damning evidence was yet to be discovered. Armed with a search warrant, investigators descended to Travis's Ferguson home, where they uncovered a collection of horrors that exceeded their worst expectations. In the basement, they found the torture chamber itself, complete with restraint devices, a stun gun, newspaper clippings of Travis's crimes, and most shocking of all, videotapes documenting his murders. One tape, which Travis had labeled "Your Wedding Day," showed him torturing, raping, and killing multiple women. The footage was so disturbing that Police Chief Joe Makwa ordered psychological counseling for every officer who viewed it. The tapes showed Travis strangling Cassandra Walker, one of his identified victims, revealing not just the fact of murder, but the casual, almost businesslike way Travis went about ending human lives. The search also revealed over 1,000 blood samples in Travis's basement, DNA evidence that would eventually link him to at least 6 known victims. Police had found not just a crime scene, but a factory of death, a place where Travis had methodically processed human beings like products on an assembly line. In total, investigators were able to link Travis to 12 confirmed murders, though he claimed in his letter to have killed 17 women. The discrepancy suggests that there may be victims whose remains were never found, women who simply vanished from the margins of society without anyone powerful enough to demand answers. Travis was charged with 2 counts of kidnapping in federal court, charges that could potentially have resulted in the death penalty, but he would never face trial for his crimes. On the evening of June 10th, 2002, just 3 days after his arrest, guards at the St. Louis County Jail found Travis hanging from a makeshift noose in his cell. Despite being on suicide watch, with guards supposedly checking on him every 15 minutes, 2 consecutive observation periods had been missed, giving Travis enough time to tear strips from his bedsheet, thread them through an air vent above the toilet, and fashion a noose. In a final act of control, he had even managed to restrain his own hands behind his back, preventing any instinctive attempt to save himself when survival instincts kicked in. Travis left behind a suicide note that provided no answers to the questions that haunted investigators. He showed no remorse for his victims, offered no explanations for his actions, and took with him any hope of understanding the psychology that had driven him to such extremes. Detective Sergeant Sachs later said the suicide was the worst thing that could happen in the investigation, not just because it denied justice to the victims' families, but because it robbed investigators of the chance to understand what creates monsters like Travis. The case had profound implications that extended far beyond Travis himself. His ability to operate undetected for so long highlighted the vulnerability of society's most marginalized members, women whose disappearances often went unnoticed because they lived on the edges of respectability. The investigation revealed how serial killers can exploit society's blind spots, targeting victims whose deaths don't generate the kind of public outrage that might force law enforcement to act more aggressively. For the families of Travis's victims, his suicide represented a terrible injustice. They would never see him stand trial, never have the opportunity to confront him with the pain he had caused, never receive the answers that might help them process their loss. The women he murdered, many of whom had struggled with addiction and poverty, deserved better than to be forgotten statistics in a case file. Perhaps most disturbing of all was what the Travis case revealed about the randomness of evil. Unlike many serial killers who show early signs of violence or come from obviously dysfunctional backgrounds, Travis had slipped through life almost unnoticed. His neighbors remembered him fondly, his co-workers saw him as reliable, and his community considered him a success story of rehabilitation after his early brush with the law. The monster had hidden in plain sight, camouflaged by ordinariness. Years later, the Travis case would take on an additional dimension of horror when a woman named Katrina McGaw unwittingly rented the Ferguson house where the murders had occurred. McGaw learned about her home's dark history only when a friend told her to watch a documentary about serial killers and she recognized her own address. When she tried to break her lease, she discovered that her landlord was Travis's mother, who initially refused to let her out of the rental agreement. The house itself became a symbol of how evil can contaminate places as well as people. McGaw reported strange occurrences, unexplained sounds, and an oppressive atmosphere that made the home feel haunted by the suffering that had occurred there. Eventually, the St. Louis Housing Authority intervened to help her break the lease, but the incident highlighted how the effects of crimes like Travis's extend far beyond the immediate victims. Today, the Maury Travis case is studied by law enforcement agencies, criminal psychologists, and students of human behavior who seek to understand how someone can live such a complete double life. His story appears in training materials at the FBI Academy in Quantico, Virginia, serving as a case study in the investigation of serial crimes and the importance of technological tools in modern law enforcement. But perhaps the most important lesson of the Travis case is that evil rarely announces itself dramatically. It doesn't always come with obvious warning signs or dramatic red flags. Sometimes It wears the face of the quiet neighbor, the helpful colleague, the man who seems so ordinary that he becomes forgettable. Travis spent his entire life being underestimated, overlooked, and ignored, qualities that served him well as a predator, but ultimately led to his downfall when his need for recognition overcame his instinct for self-preservation. The women Travis murdered deserve to be remembered not just as victims, but as human beings who had value, who had people who loved them, who had dreams and struggles and moments of joy that were cut short by one man's twisted need for power and control. Their lives mattered, even if society didn't always act like it. And in the quiet suburbs of Ferguson, Missouri, where neighbors still wave politely and life continues its ordinary rhythms, the Travis case serves as a chilling reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like us, live among us, and hide their darkness behind smiles and small acts of kindness. The challenge for all of us is to remain vigilant without becoming paranoid, to trust without being naive, and to remember that the greatest evil often wears the most ordinary face. The story of Maury Travis forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature, about the society we've created, and about our responsibility to protect the most vulnerable among us. His crimes were not just individual acts of evil, but symptoms of larger failures in how we treat mental illness, addiction, poverty, and the people who fall through the cracks of our social safety net. In the end, Travis took his secrets to the grave, leaving behind only questions, pain, and the haunting knowledge that somewhere in America there may be other quiet men living double lives, waiting for their moment to step out of the shadows and reveal the monsters they've been hiding all along. Have you ever wondered how a man who seemed too pathetic to hurt anyone could become one of Louisiana's most prolific serial killers? In the sweltering heat of southeastern Louisiana, where Spanish moss drapes over ancient cypress trees like funeral shrouds, and the murky waters of the bayou keep their secrets buried deep, there lived a man who for nearly a decade walked among his neighbors undetected. Ronald Joseph Dominique, a heavy-set pizza delivery driver who used a cane and lived in trailer parks, would become known as the Bayou Strangler after confessing to murdering at least 23 men between 1997 and 2006. What you're about to hear isn't just another serial killer story. This is the chilling account of how a man society overlooked became a predator who exploited the very customs and hospitality of Louisiana's bayou communities to hunt human beings. By the end of this story, you'll understand how Dominique's crimes exposed not just the darkness within one man, but the systemic failures that allowed him to operate in plain sight for nearly 10 years. Ronald Joseph Dominique was born on January 9th, 1964, in Thibodaux, Louisiana, the youngest of 6 children. His parents were poor laborers who lived in a trailer park located on the outskirts of the city. From the beginning, Ronald's life was marked by struggle. Growing up in poverty in the small bayou community of Thibodaux, he experienced the kind of childhood that would later be dissected by psychologists trying to understand what creates a monster. When Dominique was in school, he was frequently criticized and picked on by other students. He did not admit to his peers during his teen years that he was homosexual. Classmates who remember Dominique say he was ridiculed for being homosexual during his teen years, but at the time he never admitted he was gay. The boy who sang in the glee club and performed in the school choir was living a double life, hiding his true identity in a place where being different was not just discouraged, but actively punished. The torment he endured wasn't just verbal. During Ronald Dominique teen years of school, Ronald classmates said that he was bullied and made fun of about being a homosexual. This relentless harassment created something inside him that would fester for years. A toxic combination of shame, rage, and self-hatred that would eventually seek an outlet in the most horrific way imaginable. He graduated from high school in 1983. Because of his family's financial circumstances, Dominique had lived out his childhood and adolescence in poverty. After leaving school, he entered Nicholls State University, where he studied computer science. However, he quickly lost interest and dropped out in the mid-1980s. The pattern of his life was already becoming clear. Promise followed by failure, attempts at normalcy undermined by an inability to sustain relationships or commitments. Because of his lack of education, Dominique was forced to engage in low-skilled labor for the following years and struggled to hold down jobs due to disciplinary issues. Unwilling to keep a steady job for a long period of time, he survived by living off relatives and other people's income, most notably his mother and older sister, living with each of them for a time. On June 12, 1985, Dominique was arrested on charges of sexual harassment committed via telephone, for which he had to pay a $75 fine. This was just the beginning. He was arrested for drunk driving in May 1994 and was fined for the offense. The warnings were there, small infractions that hinted at a mind growing increasingly unstable. But it was what happened in 1996 that would change everything. On August 25, 1996, Ronald Dominique was arrested and charged with forcible rape after neighbors found a man who escaped from his home, screaming that he had tried to kill him. For the first time, Ronald had crossed the line from harassment into violence. The case never went to trial because investigators couldn't find the victim, but something had awakened in Dominique during this experience. According to the Seattle Times, Ronald Dominique committed his first crime in 1996. Authorities arrested him on the charge of forcible rape. The victim survived and went to the police. However, the case didn't go to trial because investigators couldn't find the survivor. That's when he decided that he would kill his victims because he didn't want to go to jail. This was the moment when Ronald Dominique transformed from a petty criminal into something far more dangerous. He had learned a terrible lesson: dead victims don't testify. The murders began in July 1997, with Dominique's first confirmed victim being a 19-year-old African-American man named David Mitchell. He was picked up while hitchhiking alone from his grandmother's house after attending a relative's birthday party. His body was found on July 14th in a ditch along a highway near a wooded area in St. Charles Parish, 2 days after he was last seen. David Mitchell should have made it home that night. Instead, he became the first known victim of a killer who would terrorize Louisiana for the next 9 years. Forensic research showed that there was ditch water in David's lungs, but no trace of physical trauma, drugs, or alcohol. His death was initially ruled as accidental drowning. However, Mitchell's father insisted that his son was an excellent swimmer and that he had been murdered since the water level was low, and the fact that Mitchell's trousers had been lowered to his ankles when found. Mitchell's father was right, but it would be years before anyone believed him. The first was in December 1997 when he strangled 20-year-old Gary Pierre. His body was found fully clothed, with no signs of physical trauma or drugs found in his system. The second killing occurred on July 31st, 1998, when he killed 38-year-old Larry Ranson Vagrant. Ranson was the first victim subjected to bondage by Dominique, but it was the third murder that would provide the first real evidence of what was happening. In early October 1998, Dominique met 27-year-old Oliver LeBancs in Metairie. After his arrest, he claimed that LeBancs offered him sexual services in exchange for money, after which Dominique had sex with him, then beat and strangled him. LeBancs's body was later disposed of on the outskirts of Metairie, where it was found on October 4th. During the autopsy, traces of Dominique's semen was found on Oliver's body. The victim, identified as Oliver LeBancs, lived near the French Quarter in New Orleans. He had died from asphyxia due to strangulation, according to the autopsy report. There were clearly visible marks on the side of the neck, a detective. Dennis Thornton of the Jefferson Parish Sheriff's Office told Mark of a serial killer. Hair identified as belonging to a Caucasian person was found on LeBancs's body and collected as evidence. For the first time, authorities had physical evidence linking the murders, but they didn't yet understand they were dealing with a serial killer. The victims seemed unconnected, their deaths spread across different parishes, their lifestyles marginalized. As per the investigators, all the victims were homeless men, ages between 16 and 46. The publication also noted the killer murdered all its victims by strangling them. Dominique had found his hunting ground and his methods. He targeted mostly homeless men between 18 and 40, social outcasts he felt no one would miss. Most of these men he picked up at gay bars or off the streets where they stood at night prowling for Johns. Others he would show photos of an attractive woman and boast that she was his wife and that the men could come back to his house and have sex with her even though Dominique wasn't married. His tactics in capturing, sometimes raping, then murdering the men was simple. He would lure homeless men with the promise of sex in exchange for money. Dominique then led the men to his home, asked to tie them up, then raped and eventually murdered the men to avoid arrest. In his statement to the police, Dominique said the men who refused to be tied up would leave his home unharmed. This wasn't random violence. This was calculated, methodical hunting. Dominique had learned to identify the most vulnerable members of society, men whose disappearances might not be immediately noticed or thoroughly investigated. But by 2000, the murders came to a sudden halt. Investigators, who continued to work the cases, questioned whether the killer had died or been incarcerated. The killing had stopped, but not because Dominique was dead or imprisoned. He had simply relocated. In late 2002, Dominique and his sister moved to the rural, unincorporated community of Bayou Blue. There, he found a job as a specialist who checked electricity levels at a local power supply, which allowed him to periodically travel. In October 2002 in Houma, a community about 15 miles from Jefferson Parish, a series of homicides mirroring the earlier ones began. By February 2005, there were 6 more victims, both African American and Caucasian. 7 months later, the homicide count numbered 21. Dominique was no longer the amateur killer he had been in 1997. He had refined his methods, learned from his mistakes, and grown bolder. Around this time, Dominique killed 19-year-old Detrell Woods, dumping both him and his bicycle in a reed field. Woods's decomposed and partially naked body remained undiscovered until May 24, 2003. The cause of death was deemed as asphyxiation. However, until Dominique's arrest, it was considered to be accidental in nature, since the victim was known to suffer from asthma. Even when bodies were found, the system failed to connect the dots. Each murder was treated as an isolated incident, filed away in different parish offices, investigated by different detectives who didn't communicate with each other. Dominique was counting on this bureaucratic dysfunction, and it served him well. In October 2004, Dominique lured 46-year-old Larry Matthews to his house, but during the process, Matthews lost consciousness, after which Dominique raped and strangled him. He later dumped Matthews's body 20 miles away from the crime scene. Nobody initially reported Matthews as missing since he was homeless, and his identity later had to be established via fingerprints. In February 2005, Dominique murdered 22-year-old Leon Lorette, who had previously lived with 2 other victims, Barnett and Anoka Jones, and was considered the prime suspect in Jones's murder, as he was the last person to see him prior to the former's disappearance. 2 months later, in April, Dominique met 31-year-old August Watkins, who he lured to his truck. After Watkins ended up in his trailer, Dominique tied him up, raped, and strangled the victim. It was only after Watkins's murder that law enforcement finally began to see the pattern. After Watkins's corpse was discovered, police finally began to consider for the first time that a serial killer was active in Kenner and Houma, since the murders in both areas demonstrated a strikingly similar modus operandi. The case was handed over to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. The Louisiana Attorney General's office started a task force. Police and sheriff pooled their resources and redoubled their efforts. Leads emerged, but many of them turned into dead ends. According to Jim Bernazzani, the special agent in charge, FBI profilers at the time considered Dominique's case the most significant in terms of the number of victims he had acquired in such a short period of time. But even as law enforcement mobilized, Dominique wasn't finished. A few days after killing Watkins, Dominique killed 23-year-old Kurt Cunningham. Later that summer, he murdered 28-year-old Alonzo Hogan. By October 2006, the body count numbered 23. The break in the case came not from brilliant detective work, but from a survivor. A break in the case came when Ricky Wallace, a parolee in Terrebonne Parish, came forward. He told authorities about accepting a ride from a white man who had a picture of an attractive woman on his dashboard. The driver, who was heavyset and white, asked Wallace if he'd like to have sex with the woman and be willing to be tied up by her. In November 2006, Dominique came under police suspicion after Ricky Wallace, a resident of Bayou Blue, reported that Dominique had lured him to his trailer in mid-2006 with an offer to share drugs and have sex with a girl. After Wallace entered the trailer, according to his testimony, Dominique tried to convince him that his girlfriend enjoyed bondage, offering to tie Wallace up. Ricky refused, and soon after he was allowed to leave. Wallace's instincts had saved his life. Unlike the 23 men who had accepted Dominique's proposals, Wallace had refused to be tied up and walked away. He had no idea at the time that his refusal had made the difference between life and death. Days after detectives interviewed Wallace, the body of another victim with the same marks was found. Because Houma is a small town, investigators were able to find the trailers Wallace described. They identified the driver who picked him up as 41-year-old Ronald Joseph Dominique. The property belonged to his sister. For the first time in nearly a decade, law enforcement had a name and a face. After 2 months of surveilling Dominique, investigators brought him in for questioning. They told him they wanted to discuss Ricky Wallace. While he was held at the station, Dominique agreed to donate a blood sample. Over the next week, DNA testing matched Dominique's profile with that of the elusive killer who had left behind semen traces on the bodies of Oliver LeBancs and Manuel Reed, resulting in an arrest warrant. On December 1st, 2006, Dominique was arrested at a homeless shelter. The man who had spent years hunting society's most vulnerable had become one of them himself. Just days before his arrest, Dominique had moved from his sister's home into the bunkhouse shelter in Houma, Louisiana. Residents of the home described Dominique as odd, but no one suspected he was a killer. What sparked Dominique to move from the comfort of his sister's home to the dismal surroundings of a shelter for the homeless is uncertain. Some suspect the family grew uncomfortable by the 24-hour police surveillance, and Dominique, knowing he was soon to be caught, moved away to avoid getting his family involved in his arrest. When confronted with the evidence, Dominique's facade finally crumbled. Probably within the first 20 minutes he started confessing, said Thornton. Dominique told them how he'd used a seatbelt and extension cord to strangle victims. Dominique's gift of gab and capacity to charm people were instrumental in attracting his victims, according to investigators. Dominique's angle, investigators told producers, was that his murders were justified because his victims had raped him. There would be moments that he would go off on what he remembers as an escapade of his that was sort of braggadocious, said Thornton. Even in confession, Dominique couldn't accept responsibility for what he had done. He painted himself as the victim, claiming that the men he had murdered had somehow wronged him first. It was a final act of manipulation from a man who had spent his entire adult life lying to himself and others. Dominique told the police how he used a seatbelt and extension cord to strangle victims. However, during the interrogation, the accused kept on reiterating that his victims had raped him. Dominique, who was notoriously nicknamed the Bayou Strangler, eventually confessed to 23 murders. He agreed to accompany sheriffs to spots where he had dumped bodies. Finally, in 2007, the authorities presented Dominique in court for the gruesome murders. Shockingly, he pleaded not guilty to 9 counts of murder. Eventually, he took a plea deal and pleaded guilty to 8 murders. After accepting a plea bargain from prosecutors on September 24, 2008, the court found Dominique guilty on all charges and sentenced him to 8 life imprisonment terms without parole. Dominique had avoided the death penalty by pleading guilty to all charges and is incarcerated at the Louisiana State Penitentiary in Angola. The courtroom was filled with the families of Dominique's victims, people who had waited years for answers about their loved ones' disappearances. "I hope hell finds you fast," cried the brother of one of the Bayou serial killer's victims in court. 30 relatives of Dominique's victims attended his sentencing, but even as justice was served, questions remained. How had one man managed to kill at least 23 people over nearly a decade without being caught? The answer lies not just in Dominique's cunning, but in the systematic failures that allowed him to operate. Not once during his spree was Ronald Dominique a suspect of his own crimes. He was exactly the kind of person law enforcement overlooked: overweight, physically unimposing, living on the margins of society himself. At 5 feet 5 inches, with a heart condition and grossly obese, how did Ronald Dominique manage to kill 23 men? The answer was simple. He's nothing on the street, a nobody. But here he had power. Once he got those ropes on them, they were his. Dominique had found a way to turn his perceived weakness into strength. By targeting vulnerable men, by operating across multiple jurisdictions, by exploiting the prejudices that made his victims seem less important to law enforcement, he had created the perfect hunting ground. As he got older, he seemed to live in two worlds. Outwardly, there was a side to Dominique who enjoyed helping people. He joined the Lions Club just months before his arrest and spent Sunday afternoons calling out bingo numbers to senior citizens. The membership director said he was well liked by everyone he had met through the Lions Club. This was perhaps the most chilling aspect of Dominique's story: his ability to maintain a facade of normalcy while committing unspeakable acts. To his neighbors, he was just another struggling man trying to get by. To the seniors at the Lions Club, he was a helpful volunteer. To his victims, he was death itself. Ronald Dominique's story reveals uncomfortable truths about how society values different lives. His victims were largely homeless, many struggling with addiction or mental illness, some involved in sex work. They were people society had already written off, making it easier for their disappearances to be ignored or explained away. The case also exposed the dangers of jurisdictional fragmentation in law enforcement. Because Dominique operated across multiple parishes, different police departments investigated his crimes in isolation, failing to see the larger pattern until it was almost too late. Today, Ronald Dominique sits in a cell at Angola State Penitentiary, serving 8 consecutive life sentences. He will never see freedom again, but the victims he claimed, the families he destroyed, and the communities he terrorized will never fully recover from the decade of horror he inflicted. Despite the number of victims, Dominique's arrest received little publicity outside of the state media. Unlike other serial killers who became household names, Dominique remains largely unknown outside of Louisiana. Perhaps that's fitting for a man who spent his life in the shadows, preying on those society had forgotten. But their stories deserve to be remembered. David Mitchell, Gary Pierre, Larry Ranson, Oliver LeBancs, and the 19 other men whose lives were cut short by Ronald Dominique were more than just victims. They were sons, brothers, friends, human beings who deserved better than the violent ends they met in the Louisiana bayous. The Bayou Strangler's reign of terror finally ended, but the scars he left behind remain. In the communities he terrorized, in the families still seeking answers, and in the uncomfortable questions his case raises about how we value human life and protect the most vulnerable among us. Evil, it turns out, doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it arrives in the form of an overweight man with a cane offering a ride to someone with nowhere else to go. And sometimes, by the time we recognize it for what it is, it's already too late. Have you ever wondered how someone who worked as a police auxiliary officer, someone entrusted with public safety, could become one of Florida's most vicious serial killers? In the warm coastal waters of Vero Beach, Florida, where sunseekers flock to pristine beaches and families build their American dreams, a darkness was lurking beneath the surface. During the early 1980s, young women began disappearing from this picturesque community. Some vanished while hitchhiking to the beach, others while going about their daily lives. What authorities didn't realize was that the predator hunting these women wore a badge, drove through their neighborhoods with impunity, and had turned the very symbols of protection into tools of destruction. David Allen Gore and his cousin, Fred Waterfield, would become known as the Killing Cousins, responsible for the brutal murders of at least 6 women between 1981 and 1983. Their reign of terror would expose the horrifying reality that evil doesn't always announce itself with warning signs. Sometimes it comes wearing a uniform, offering help, and appearing as the very person you're supposed to trust. By the end of this story, you'll understand how Gore manipulated his position of authority to hunt human beings, how his partnership with his cousin created a killing machine that terrorized Florida's coast, and how one terrified teenager's desperate escape finally brought their rampage to an end. David Allen Gore was born on August 21st, 1953, in Florida. From the outside, his early life appeared unremarkable, but beneath the surface, troubling patterns were already emerging. Described as a large man who would eventually weigh 275 pounds, Gore fit what many would consider a stereotypical image, but his size was the least concerning thing about him. His first job as a gas station attendant ended abruptly when his boss made a disturbing discovery. Gore had drilled a hole into the wall of the women's restroom, creating a makeshift peephole that allowed him to spy on female customers. This wasn't teenage curiosity or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a calculated violation that revealed a fundamental disrespect for boundaries and an early manifestation of the predatory behavior that would define his life. The incident at the gas station was dismissed by those around him as a stupid mistake, but it was actually a window into Gore's twisted psyche. He wasn't content to simply fantasize about his desires. He acted on them. He planned them. He created opportunities to violate women's privacy, and when caught, he showed no genuine remorse. Gore's troubled background and what court documents later described as his deprived childhood would be cited as mitigating factors during his eventual trial. But the details of his early family life remain largely shrouded, leaving gaps in understanding how he became the monster he would eventually become. What is clear is that by his teenage years, deviant behavior was already his norm, not his exception. As Gore moved into adulthood, he sought positions that would give him access to potential victims. He became an auxiliary sheriff's deputy, a role that provided him with a badge, authority, and most importantly, trust. To the community, he was someone who was supposed to protect them. To Gore, the badge was a hunting license. He also worked as a caretaker of a citrus grove, a job that provided him with isolation and seclusion. The grove became more than just his workplace, it became his burial ground. But Gore didn't operate alone in his darkest impulses. His partner in these horrific crimes was his older cousin, Fred Waterfield. Waterfield was the leader of the pair, the one who Gore looked up to and followed. Together, they formed what criminal psychologists would later describe as a morbid alliance. They didn't just enable each other's worst impulses, they amplified them. Their relationship created a feedback loop of violence, where each cousin's presence made the other more dangerous, more bold, and more ruthless. The cousins had already been suspects in criminal activity before their killing spree began. In 1976, a 20-year-old woman named Angela Hommel Austin accused both Gore and Waterfield of raping her at gunpoint. The cousins claimed the sex was consensual and they were not charged. It was a warning sign that law enforcement failed to heed, a missed opportunity that would cost multiple lives. Gore targeted at least 4 additional women who managed to escape with their lives. These survivors would later describe a man who used his authority and fake helpfulness to lure them into danger. His method was always the same: appear helpful, gain trust, isolate the victim, then strike. The killing began in earnest on February 19th, 1981, with victims who represented Gore's preferred targets, vulnerable women who could be easily isolated. His first 2 murder victims were Yinghua Ling, age 17, and her mother Xiang Huang Ling, age 48. Gore approached the teenager first, brandishing his auxiliary police badge to lure her into his truck. The badge, a symbol that should have represented safety and authority, had become a weapon in the hands of a predator. After convincing Ying to get into his vehicle, Gore drove her to her own home, where he encountered her mother. What happened next reveals the calculated cruelty that defined Gore's crimes. He kidnapped both women, taking them to a secluded location where he met up with Waterfield. Gore later told authorities that they tied the mother to a tree, where she slowly choked to death while he and Waterfield raped her daughter. The deliberate torture, the prolonged suffering, the complete dehumanization of these women, this wasn't crime of passion or momentary madness. This was planned sadism. After murdering both women, Gore and Waterfield dismembered their bodies and stuffed the parts into oil drums, which they buried in the citrus grove where Gore worked. The methodical disposal of the remains shows how prepared they were for this outcome. They had thought through not just the killing, but the cleanup. They had turned murder into a routine. The Ling's disappearance was initially treated as a missing persons case. Without bodies, without physical evidence, and with Gore's position as an auxiliary deputy providing him cover, the investigation stalled. The killers had gotten away with murder, and they knew it. Emboldened by their success, Gore and Waterfield struck again just months later. Their third victim was Judith Daly, a 35-year-old former Fort Pierce resident who was visiting from California. On July 15th, 1981, Gore spotted Daly at the beach and saw an opportunity. Using a technique he would perfect over time, Gore disabled Daly's car, then approached her as a helpful stranger offering assistance, he told her he would give her a ride to the nearest telephone so she could call for help. Daly, stranded and grateful for what seemed like Good Samaritan assistance, accepted the ride. Gore drove Daly to a secluded area where he met Waterfield. Both men raped Daly before killing her. Gore later claimed to have disposed of her body in a swamp where it was never recovered. Another life had been extinguished, another family left wondering what happened to their loved one. But Gore's luck was starting to run out. A week after Daly's murder, he attempted to use his auxiliary badge to abduct another teenage girl. This time, however, the girl's father was suspicious and filed a complaint with authorities. Gore was stripped of his badge, losing the most powerful tool in his predatory arsenal. The loss of his badge should have ended Gore's ability to easily lure victims, but it didn't stop his compulsion to kill. Days after losing his badge, police spotted Gore hiding in the back seat of a woman's car, carrying a police scanner, handcuffs, and a pistol. He had been caught in the act of what was surely another attempted kidnapping. Gore was convicted of armed trespassing and sentenced to 5 years in prison. It should have been the end of his killing spree. Instead, the justice system failed again. Gore was released on parole in March 1983 after serving less than 2 years. He had been given another chance, and he would use it to kill again. On May 20th, 1983, Gore and Waterfield encountered 2 teenage hitchhikers from Orlando, Angelica Lavallee and Barbara Ann Byer, both just 14 years old. The girls were looking for a ride, trusting in the basic decency of strangers. That trust would cost them their lives. Gore and Waterfield picked up the girls and took them to a secluded location where both men raped, killed, and dismembered them. These murders were different from the previous ones in their sheer brutality and the youth of the victims. Lavallee and Byer were children, killed by men who saw them as nothing more than objects for their twisted gratification. Ironically, these would be the only murders for which Waterfield was ever convicted. While Gore admitted to participating in all 6 killings, prosecutors could only prove Waterfield's involvement in the deaths of Lavallee and Byer. He would be sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences for these murders, while continuing to maintain his innocence and claiming he was manipulated by Gore. But Gore wasn't finished. His final victims would be 2 teenagers whose encounter with the killing cousins would ultimately lead to Gore's downfall. On July 26, 1983, Lynn Elliott, age 17, and Reagan Martin, age 14, were hitchhiking to Wabasso Beach when Gore and Waterfield picked them up. The girls were students at Vero Beach High School, looking forward to a day at the beach. Instead, they were driven at gunpoint to a house owned by Gore's parents. It was here that Gore would make the mistake that would finally end his reign of terror. Waterfield, spooked by having seen his sister during the drive, left the scene. This meant Gore was alone with 2 victims for the first time. He bound the girls and placed them in different rooms before beginning his assault. First, he raped Reagan Martin, but Lynn Elliott, despite being nude with her hands tied behind her back, managed to escape. Elliott ran from the house, stumbling and falling in the driveway, but continuing to flee even as Gore pursued her. She was screaming, fighting for her life, trying to reach safety. But Gore caught up to her. In front of his parents' house, in broad daylight, he shot the 17-year-old girl twice in the head at point-blank range. What Gore didn't realize was that a neighbor's young son, riding his bicycle, had witnessed the entire horrific scene. The boy saw a naked teenage girl running for her life. He saw a man chasing her. He saw the shooting, and he immediately alerted the police. The call to 911 led to a 90-minute standoff between Gore and law enforcement. For the first time in years, Gore found himself cornered, surrounded with nowhere to run. The police had him trapped, and they knew there was another victim still in the house. When officers finally arrested Gore and entered the house, they found Reagan Martin alive in the attic, naked, handcuffed, and with electrical cords tied around her legs. She was traumatized but alive, and she could identify both Gore and Waterfield as her attackers. For the first time, the killers had left a living witness. Martin's survival and testimony would prove crucial to the prosecution's case. She could describe in detail what had happened to her and Elliot. She could identify both men. She could provide the human face of their victims that prosecutors needed to secure convictions. On December 7th, 1983, facing overwhelming evidence and the testimony of a surviving victim, Gore led police to the remains of 3 of his murder victims: Barbara Ann Byer, Xiang Huang Ling, and her daughter Ying Hua Ling. The oil drums buried in the citrus grove were unearthed, revealing the dismembered remains that had been hidden for years. Gore confessed to killing 6 women in total, though investigators suspected the true number might be higher. His willingness to confess was less about remorse and more about his desire to avoid the death penalty and his narcissistic need to be seen as important. But Gore's confessions would prove to be both his downfall and his final act of manipulation. Even from death row, he continued to write letters, describing his crimes in grotesque detail, seemingly relishing the opportunity to relive his murders. These letters, later published in a book called The Serial Killer Whisperer, provided disturbing insights into Gore's complete lack of remorse. In the letters, Gore wrote about his crimes with a chilling matter-of-factness. He described the fear in his victims' eyes, the sound of their pleas for mercy, the satisfaction he felt in exerting complete control over another human being. He didn't write these letters seeking forgiveness or expressing regret. He wrote them because he enjoyed recounting his crimes. Those letters are so disturbing and so insightful into who this person is, said Pete Early, the author who published Gore's correspondence. Gore, actually, he talked his way into the death chamber. The letters came to the attention of Florida Governor Rick Scott through a newspaper columnist who had been following the case. Despite more than 40 other inmates having been on death row longer than Gore, Scott signed Gore's death warrant after learning about the prison correspondence and the disturbing insights they provided into Gore's psyche. Gore's trial was moved from Vero Beach to St. Petersburg due to the extensive media coverage and community outrage. On March 16th, 1984, the jury convicted him of first-degree murder, and after an 11-1 vote, he received the death sentence. The single holdout juror later said they believed Gore deserved to die, but struggled with the moral implications of voting for execution. Waterfield was tried separately and convicted of the murders of Byer and Lavallee. He received 2 consecutive life sentences and maintains his innocence to this day, claiming he was manipulated and controlled by Gore. His family, including his twin daughters, has been vocal in supporting his claims of innocence, though the evidence against him remains strong. Gore spent 28 years on death row, using every legal avenue available to delay his execution. He filed appeal after appeal, claiming everything from ineffective counsel to mental incompetence. His attorneys argued that his deprived childhood and mental state should spare him from execution, but courts consistently rejected these arguments. During his time on death row, Gore was described as a model prisoner who caused no trouble and even expressed religious faith. But this apparent reformation was undermined by his letters, which showed that he continued to derive satisfaction from his crimes decades after committing them. On April 12, 2012, David Allen Gore was executed by lethal injection at Florida State Prison. He was 58 years old and had exhausted all legal appeals. As he lay strapped to the gurney in the death chamber, Gore made a final statement. "I'm sorry. I've had remorse. I'm not the man I was back then. I don't fear death." But those who knew the case remained skeptical of Gore's claimed remorse. Lynn Elliott's family, who had waited nearly 30 years for justice, said they doubted the sincerity of his final words. Too many years had passed. Too many letters had been written celebrating his crimes for his last-minute expressions of regret to carry weight. The execution was witnessed by 24 relatives and law enforcement personnel. Prison official Tim Cannon announced that the death sentence was carried out at 6:19 p.m. Gore became the 73rd person to be executed in Florida since the state reinstituted the death penalty in 1976. Detective Tom White, who had investigated Gore years before his final arrest, was present for the execution. White had always known Gore was a killer, but had been unable to prove it until after more victims died. The frustration of coming so close to stopping Gore before his final murders never left White. They were like 5 or 6 feet away inside the drums, White said about the remains of the Lings, which were buried just feet from where he had stopped digging during his original investigation. "I couldn't believe it." The knowledge that he had been so close to finding the bodies and stopping Gore before he killed again haunted White for decades. The case of David Allen Gore reveals uncomfortable truths about how predators can hide in plain sight, using positions of authority and trust to access victims. Gore's badge didn't make him a killer, but it made him a more effective one. It gave him credibility, access, and the ability to approach potential victims without raising suspicion. Gore's partnership with his cousin, Fred Waterfield, shows how 2 individuals can enable and amplify each other's worst impulses. Neither man might have become a serial killer on his own, but together they created a killing machine that terrorized Florida's coast for years. The failures of the justice system in Gore's case are striking. He was suspected of rape, but not prosecuted. He was caught in what appeared to be an attempted kidnapping, but received a light sentence and early release. Each time the system failed to stop him, more innocent people died. Perhaps most disturbing is Gore's complete lack of genuine remorse, even decades after his crimes. His letters from death row show a man who continued to derive satisfaction from recounting his murders, who saw his victims not as human beings, but as objects that existed for his gratification. The surviving victim, Regan Martin, showed remarkable courage in testifying against her attackers. Her survival and willingness to relive her trauma in court was crucial to securing justice for all of Gore's victims. She turned her victimization into a form of resistance, ensuring that Gore and Waterfield would be held accountable for their crimes. Fred Waterfield remains in prison, serving his life sentences at Hardy Correctional Institution. He continues to maintain his innocence, claiming he was another victim of Gore's manipulation. His family supports his claims, but the evidence against him remains strong, and he will likely spend the rest of his life behind bars. The families of Gore's victims waited decades for justice. Some, like Judy Daly's husband Mike, lived with the pain of not knowing what happened to their loved ones for years before Gore's confessions provided answers. "I've been waiting for this day for years," Mike Daly said after Gore's execution. "I would have saved the state a lot of money if they let me. I'd do it myself and have no qualms about it." The case exposed how serial killers can exploit society's trust and the symbols of protection to hunt human beings. Gore's auxiliary badge was supposed to represent safety and authority. Instead, it became a tool of predation, allowing him to approach victims under the guise of offering help. The geographic isolation of Gore's hunting ground, the rural citrus groves, and secluded beaches of Indian River County provided him with perfect disposal sites and minimal police presence. His familiarity with the area, gained through his work as a grove caretaker, allowed him to hide bodies where they might never be found. Criminal psychologists who studied the case noted how Gore and Waterfield formed what they called a morbid alliance, each making the other more dangerous. The cousins didn't just commit crimes together. They created a shared fantasy world where violence against women was normalized and celebrated. The boy who witnessed Lynn Elliott's murder and alerted police became an unsung hero in the case. His quick thinking and courage in reporting what he saw led directly to Gore's capture and the rescue of Regan Martin. Without his intervention, Martin would likely have become another victim, and Gore might have continued killing for years. Gore's case also highlights the importance of taking early warning signs seriously. His voyeuristic behavior at the gas station, his attempted abduction using a fake badge, his arrest for armed trespassing, these were all escalating behaviors that indicated a dangerous predator. Each incident was an opportunity to intervene before he killed, but those opportunities were missed. The publication of Gore's letters from death row raised ethical questions about giving voice to killers and potentially traumatizing victims' families. While the letters provided psychological insights into Gore's mindset, they also allowed him to continue victimizing families by forcing them to relive their trauma through his detailed descriptions of his crimes. David Allen Gore represents a particular type of predator, one who uses societal trust and institutional authority to access victims. His case serves as a reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with obvious warning signs. Sometimes it comes wearing a uniform, offering help, and appearing as the very person you're supposed to trust. The killing cousins left a trail of devastation across Florida that extended far beyond their immediate victims. They destroyed families, shattered communities' sense of safety, and exposed the vulnerabilities in systems designed to protect the innocent. Their crimes reminded everyone that monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they walk among us, hiding behind badges and smiles and the pretense of being helpful. Gore's execution in 2012 marked the end of a case that had haunted Florida for 3 decades. But for the families of his victims, for the community of Vero Beach, and for Regan Martin, who survived to tell their story, the scars remain. Some wounds never fully heal, and some names, like David Allen Gore, become synonymous with the darkest capabilities of human nature. The case stands as a testament to the importance of vigilance, of taking warning signs seriously, and of never assuming that authority or position makes someone trustworthy. It reminds us that predators often hide in plain sight, using our own trust and societal structures against us. In the end, David Allen Gore was exactly what he appeared to be in those letters from death row: a man without remorse, without empathy, and without any genuine understanding of the humanity of his victims. He was executed not just for his crimes, but for his complete and unrepentant embrace of evil. The world became a safer place the day David Allen Gore drew his last breath. In the quiet town of Poughkeepsie, New York, nestled along the Hudson River, just 60 miles north of Manhattan, there lived a man whose presence filled rooms with unease long before anyone understood why. His name was Kendall Francois, and by day he wandered the halls of Arlington Middle School as a student monitor, earning the cruel but accurate nickname Stinky from children who instinctively recoiled from his approach. But what no one realized, what no one could have imagined, was that the overwhelming stench that followed him wasn't just poor hygiene or slovenly habits. It was the smell of death itself, seeping through the walls of the house where he lived with his parents and younger sister, a house that harbored one of the most disturbing secrets in American criminal history. In the late 1990s, as America celebrated its economic prosperity and technological advancement, the streets of Poughkeepsie became a hunting ground for a predator whose very ordinariness made him almost invisible. Kendall Francois stood 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighed over 300 pounds, an imposing figure who moved through his community like a gentle giant. Teachers knew him as inappropriate but harmless. Students saw him as the smelly hall monitor who made uncomfortable jokes. His family viewed him as their quiet, sometimes troubled son. But beneath this facade of normalcy, Francois was methodically stalking, murdering, and collecting women whose lives society had already deemed disposable. Born on July 26, 1971, Kendall was the second of 4 children to Haitian immigrant parents who had built what appeared to be a stable middle-class life in Poughkeepsie. His mother, Paulette, worked as a nurse at Hudson River Psychiatric Center, dedicating her life to helping the mentally ill find employment and dignity. His younger sister, Kirsten, pursued a degree in family studies, drawn to helping others heal from trauma. The bitter irony of their chosen professions would become apparent only after the truth about Kendall emerged, a truth so horrifying that it would shatter not only their family, but their fundamental understanding of the person they thought they knew. As a teenager, Kendall had been an athlete, playing football and wrestling at Arlington High School despite his increasing size. Classmates remembered him as quiet, but not threatening, large, but not particularly aggressive. He was, by most accounts, unremarkable, the kind of person who faded into the background of other people's stories. After graduating in 1989, he enlisted in the United States Army, where he completed basic training at Fort Sill, Oklahoma. For 4 years, he served his country, but his military career ended abruptly when he was discharged due to obesity issues, weighing 320 pounds by the time he left the service. Returning to Poughkeepsie in 1993, Kendall enrolled at Dutchess Community College as a liberal arts major, drifting through classes with no clear direction or purpose. It was during this period that he took a job at Arlington Middle School, first as a part-time custodian and later as a student monitor. The position required him to patrol hallways, supervise detentions, and maintain order among the students. But even in this role, warning signs began to emerge that no one properly heeded. Teachers complained about Kendall's inappropriate behavior with female students. He would tell them sexual jokes, touch their hair without permission, and hug them in ways that made everyone uncomfortable. The complaints were filed, meetings were held, but the behavior continued. Perhaps because of his size, perhaps because of assumptions about his gentle nature, perhaps because society was less vigilant about such warnings in the 1990s, the red flags were noted but not acted upon with the urgency they deserved. In January 1997, Kendall left his position at the middle school, claiming he was going to work at Anderson School, a special education institution for mentally disabled children in nearby Stottsburg. The school, however, had no record of hiring him. By this time, Kendall Francois was no longer just an inappropriate school employee. He had become something far more dangerous. He had discovered that killing was easier than forming relationships, and he had begun his systematic murder of women whose disappearances would barely register with the larger community. His first victim was 30-year-old Wendy Myers, a sex worker whom Francois had patronized multiple times before. On October 24th, 1996, he picked her up at the Valley Rest Motel, a decrepit establishment that served as both lodging and informal marketplace for Poughkeepsie's street economy. What began as a routine transaction quickly turned deadly when Francois began choking Myers during their encounter. When she lost consciousness but remained alive, he carried her to the bathroom and held her face down in the bathtub until she drowned. The methodical way Francois disposed of Myers's body revealed a mind that had already crossed the line from impulse to calculation. He washed her corpse in the family bathtub, wrapped it in plastic garbage bags, and carried it to the attic of the family home on Fulton Avenue. There, in the space above where his parents and sister lived their daily lives, Wendy Myers became the first resident of what would become a makeshift morgue. A month later, on November 29th, 1996, Francois killed again. 29-year-old Gina Barone, another sex worker who knew him as a regular customer, met her death in his car, parked on a quiet side street. Francois strangled her with such force that he broke the bones in her neck, then shoved her body under the front seat while he drove home. That night, he left her corpse in the garage, and the next day, she joined Wendy Myers in the attic, wrapped in garbage bags, and left to decompose in the suffocating darkness above his family's living room. Days later, Francois claimed his third victim, Kathy Marsh, who was pregnant at the time of her murder. The The fact that he killed a woman carrying a child revealed the complete absence of any moral boundary in his thinking. Marcia's body joined the others in the attic, three women lined up side by side in what had become Francois's private cemetery. What makes Kendall Francois's crimes particularly chilling is not just their brutality, but the way he managed to compartmentalize his double life. By day, he was the dutiful son who drove his mother to work at the psychiatric center, the harmless giant who roamed school hallways, the family member who shared meals and conversation with people who loved him. By night, he cruised the streets of downtown Poughkeepsie, looking for women whose vulnerability matched his predatory needs. The women he chose shared certain characteristics that revealed his particular pathology. Most were white, slight of build, with dark hair. All were involved in sex work, struggling with addiction, living on society's margins where their disappearances might go unnoticed or be quickly explained away. Francois didn't just select them randomly. He was a repeat customer who had observed their routines, learned their vulnerabilities, and calculated how to exploit their desperation. As 1997 progressed, more women vanished from Poughkeepsie's streets. Kathleen Hurley, 47 years old, disappeared in January. Mary Healy Giacone, 29, was reported missing in November, though she had actually been killed months earlier. The body count was rising, but the pattern remained invisible to authorities who saw only individual disappearances rather than the work of a serial killer. Police knew something was wrong, but they struggled to connect the dots. These were women whose lifestyles made them inherently transient, whose relationships with law enforcement were complicated by the illegality of their work, whose families often had limited resources to push for investigations. Lieutenant Bill Segrist of the Poughkeepsie Police Department was one of the few who suspected these weren't isolated incidents, but without bodies or crime scenes, building a case seemed impossible. The breakthrough came through the victims themselves. Several sex workers had complained to police about a large black man who was violent during encounters, who choked them and became increasingly aggressive. The description consistently pointed to the same person, Kendall Francois. Police began surveillance of his home and even had an undercover officer meet with him, but they found little concrete evidence of wrongdoing. Meanwhile, inside the house on Fulton Avenue, a horror story was unfolding that defied belief. The family home had become uninhabitable, filled with garbage, human waste, and the overwhelming stench of decomposition. Maggots thrived in sinks and covered surfaces throughout the house. Kendall's sister Kirsten slept on a mattress covered with insect casings. The smell was so overpowering that neighbors complained, but Kendall had a ready explanation. A family of raccoons had died in the attic, and he was having trouble removing the carcasses. The explanation satisfied his family, perhaps because the alternative was too horrific to contemplate. His mother, a trained psychiatric nurse who spent her days helping others recognize and address mental health issues, accepted the story. His father, his siblings, they all lived with the smell, adapting to conditions that should have triggered immediate investigation. The human capacity for denial, for accepting explanations that preserve our sense of normalcy, allowed Kendall Francois to continue killing with impunity. In early 1998, space became an issue. The attic was full, and Francois needed new locations for his victims. He began using the crawl space beneath the house, creating a second repository for bodies in the foundation of the family home. Audrey Pugliese and Katina Newmaster, his final two victims, were stored in this underground chamber where they remained hidden even as police patrols increased in the neighborhood. Francois' killing spree finally ended, not because of brilliant detective work or forensic evidence, but because of his own escalating recklessness and the extraordinary courage of a woman named Christine Scala. On September 1st, 1998, Francois attempted to assault Scala in his garage. Fortunately, his sister Kirsten interrupted the attack by asking to use the family car, giving Scala the opportunity to escape. She ran to a nearby gas station and called police, setting in motion the events that would finally expose the truth about Kendall Francois. When police arrived at the Fulton Avenue house with a search warrant on September 2nd, 1998, they discovered a scene that veteran investigators would later describe as the most disturbing they had ever encountered. The smell hit them before they entered the building, a combination of death, decay, and human waste that made breathing difficult. Inside, they found garbage piled floor to ceiling, human feces smeared on walls, and conditions so squalid that hazmat suits were required. But it was in the attic and crawl space that the true horror was revealed. 8 bodies in various stages of decomposition, wrapped in plastic bags and abandoned in the darkness. Some had been there for nearly 2 years, reduced to skeletal remains and rotting fabric. Others were more recent, still recognizable as the women they had once been. The crime scene was unlike anything in local law enforcement experience, a house of horrors hidden in plain sight in a middle-class neighborhood. Kendall Francois was arrested without resistance. When confronted with the evidence, he confessed not with remorse or emotion, but with the same detached calmness he had displayed throughout his killing spree. He described the murders matter-of-factly, explaining his methods and motives with chilling precision. When asked why he had killed these women, he gave an answer that revealed the depths of his psychological dysfunction. Killing seemed easier than getting into a relationship. The confession opened a window into a mind that had compartmentalized murder as a solution to social anxiety and sexual frustration. Francois didn't kill in a rage or during a psychotic break. He killed because it was, to him, more convenient than developing normal human connections. The women he murdered weren't people to him. They were obstacles to be removed or objects to be used and discarded. During his trial, Francois showed no remorse for his actions. When families of victims gave impact statements describing the pain of losing their loved ones, he laughed. His lawyer claimed the laughter was nervous energy, but to observers, it appeared to be genuine amusement at their suffering. He pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder, avoiding the death penalty in exchange for life in prison without possibility of parole. Even in custody, Francois continued to reveal disturbing aspects of his psychology. He told investigators that he could have kept going if he hadn't been caught, suggesting that the 8 confirmed victims were just the beginning of what might have been a much larger killing spree. He showed no understanding of the horror he had inflicted, no recognition of his victims as human beings deserving of life and dignity. The case of Kendall Francois exposed uncomfortable truths about how society values certain lives over others. The women he killed were marginalized, struggling with addiction, working in an illegal profession that made them vulnerable to violence. Their disappearances were initially treated as routine occurrences rather than urgent missing person cases. It took nearly 2 years for law enforcement to recognize the pattern, during which time 6 more women died. The Francois family was devastated by the revelations. They issued a statement through their attorney expressing shock and disbelief, claiming they had no knowledge of their son's crimes. The statement read, "We find ourselves plagued by unimaginable circumstances. Our youngest son is suspected of committing grave offenses from which his life hangs in the balance." They retreated from public life, their own trauma compounded by the knowledge that they had unknowingly lived with the evidence of multiple murders for years. Francois was sentenced to life in prison and housed initially at Attica Correctional Facility, then transferred to Wende Correctional Facility shortly before his death. During his incarceration, it was revealed that he had tested positive for HIV in 1995, suggesting he may have infected some of his victims before killing them. The disease he carried added another layer of cruelty to his crimes, a final violation of the women whose lives he had already stolen. In prison, Francois attracted the attention of journalists and true crime writers fascinated by his case. Author Claudia Rowe corresponded with him extensively, trying to understand the psychological mechanisms that had created such a monster. In their exchanges, Francois showed no insight into his pathology, no recognition of the pain he had caused. He remained until his death a man who had chosen murder over human connection and felt no regret about that choice. Kendall Francois died of cancer on September 11, 2014, at the age of 43, still serving his life sentence. His death was unremarkable, noted briefly in local newspapers, and quickly forgotten by a world that had moved on to other tragedies. But for the families of his victims, for the Poughkeepsie community that had lived in fear during his killing spree, and for anyone trying to understand how evil can hide behind the mask of ordinary life, his story remains a haunting reminder of humanity's capacity for darkness. The house on Fulton Avenue stood empty for years after the murders, a crime scene so contaminated that it was eventually demolished. Neighbors reported that even after Francois' arrest, even after the bodies were removed and the evidence collected, the smell of death seemed to linger. Whether this was reality or psychological trauma, the physical reminder of what had happened there was too much for the community to bear. What makes Kendall Francois particularly terrifying is not just what he did, but how ordinary he appeared while doing it. He wasn't a charismatic sociopath like Ted Bundy or a visibly disturbed loner like Jeffrey Dahmer. He was a quiet, unremarkable man who blended into his community, who held down jobs and maintained family relationships while systematically murdering women and storing their bodies in his home. His case proves that monsters don't always announce themselves with obvious warning signs. Sometimes they smile at you in the hallway, drive their mothers to work, and attend family dinners while hiding horrors that defy imagination. The victims of Kendall Francois deserve to be remembered not just as statistics in a serial killer's body count, but as individuals whose lives had value and meaning. Wendy Myers was a member of St. James the Apostle Roman Catholic Church. Gina Barone was someone's daughter, someone's friend. Catherine Marsh was carrying a child when she died. Each woman had a story, dreams, relationships, and potential that was cut short by a man who saw them only as objects for his use. Their deaths exposed the vulnerabilities of women working in sex trade, the inadequacies of law enforcement's response to missing persons cases involving marginalized individuals, and the capacity for evil to hide behind the most mundane facades. But perhaps most importantly, their stories remind us that in a world where some lives are valued less than others, predators like Kendall Francois can operate with devastating efficiency, counting on society's indifference to protect them from consequences. In the end, Kendall Francois was not a complex psychological puzzle or a tragic figure shaped by circumstances beyond his control. He was a predator who made deliberate choices to inflict suffering and death on vulnerable women. His story is not one of mental illness or social failure, but of moral emptiness and calculated cruelty. He chose murder because it was easier than empathy, death because it was simpler than life, and he continued choosing it until he was finally stopped, not by justice or investigation, but by the courage of a woman who refused to become his next victim. The case remains a stark reminder that evil doesn't always announce itself with dramatic flourishes or obvious signs. Sometimes it lives quietly next door, attends the same schools, works in the same buildings, and shares the same last name. Kendall Francois proved that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones we never see coming, the ones who have learned to hide in plain sight while pursuing their dark appetites. In a world that wants to believe that evil is easily identifiable and always punished, his story serves as an uncomfortable truth about the real nature of human predation and the fragility of the safety we all take for granted. In the sprawling neighborhoods of Kansas City, Missouri, where the warm summer evenings once echoed with children's laughter and the comfortable rhythms of working-class life, there prowled a predator whose very ordinariness was his most terrifying weapon. His name was Lorenzo Jerome Gilliard, Jr., and for over 16 years, he moved through the shadows of his community like a ghost, collecting lives with the methodical patience of a man who had learned to disguise his hunger behind the mask of respectability. By day, Lorenzo was the reliable supervisor at Deffenbaugh Disposal Service, the kind of man who showed up early, stayed late, and earned the respect of his coworkers. He was punctual, personable, even promoted to oversee garbage disposal teams across various parts of the city. To his neighbors on Kenwood Avenue, he was the quiet man who kept to himself, maintaining his small house on a dead-end street with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. To the women who crossed his path in the darkness, he was death incarnate, wrapped in the deceptive package of someone who looked like everyone else. But Lorenzo Gilliard was anything but ordinary. He was a predator whose killing spree would span from 1977 to 1993, claiming the lives of at least 13 women and girls, most of whom were sex workers, struggling to survive on Kansas City's unforgiving streets. What made him particularly terrifying wasn't just the brutality of his crimes, but the calculated way he selected victims from society's most vulnerable margins, women whose disappearances might go unnoticed, whose deaths might be dismissed as occupational hazards rather than the methodical work of a serial killer. The man who would become known as the Kansas City Strangler was born on May 24, 1950, into a family where violence wasn't an aberration but a way of life. Lorenzo was one of 5 children born to Lorenzo Gilliard Sr. and Laura Brown, and from the earliest moments of his existence, aggression seemed to course through his veins like poison. Even as a child, Lorenzo exhibited behaviors that should have served as warnings to anyone paying attention. He was larger than most of his peers, and he used that size advantage to terrorize smaller children, earning himself a reputation as a schoolyard bully who seemed to take genuine pleasure in causing pain. The Gilliard household was a breeding ground for criminality, a place where dysfunction was normalized and violence was passed down like a family heirloom. Lorenzo's father would be convicted of rape in 1970, setting a disturbing precedent that would echo through the family for generations. His brother Daryl would eventually receive a life sentence without parole for a drug-related murder in 1989, while his sister Patricia Dixon, who worked as a sex worker, was convicted of murdering a client in 1983 and sentenced to 10 years in prison. This wasn't just a family touched by crime, it was a family consumed by it, where the normal boundaries between right and wrong seemed to have been erased entirely. Lorenzo's formal education ended abruptly when he dropped out of school after the 10th grade, unable to maintain the discipline required for academic success. His chronic absenteeism, poor performance, and complete lack of self-control had marked him as a lost cause in the eyes of educators who were probably relieved to see him go. But what they didn't understand was that they were releasing a predator into the world, someone whose inability to function within normal social structures would manifest in increasingly dangerous ways. In the mid-1960s, Lorenzo met a young woman named Rena Hill, and their relationship quickly became a preview of the violence that would define his interactions with women for the rest of his life. By 1968, when Lorenzo was just 18, he married Rena in what would become the first of 4 failed marriages, each one marked by escalating patterns of abuse and control. The marriage to Rena was troubled from the beginning, characterized by physical and sexual abuse that revealed the depth of Lorenzo's pathological need to dominate and hurt the women in his life. The first official glimpse into Lorenzo's criminal nature came in January 1969 when he was arrested for assaulting and raping a girl he knew. But even then, the system failed to recognize the danger he represented. The charges were dropped after a reconciliation agreement was reached, with the victim retracting her accusations after Lorenzo offered what passed for an apology. It was a pattern that would repeat itself throughout his early adult years, a cycle of violence followed by manipulation, legal consequences that never quite stuck, and a system that seemed incapable of recognizing the escalating threat he represented. In 1970, as his father was being convicted of rape, Lorenzo was arrested again for assaulting and raping another woman. The victim claimed he had choked her into unconsciousness, a detail that would become a signature element of his future crimes. She identified him from a lineup, but once again, the charges were mysteriously dropped when her testimony was deemed questionable. It was as if Lorenzo possessed some dark charm that allowed him to slip through the cracks of a system that should have been protecting his victims. By 1973, the violence had reached such levels that Rena Hill finally went to the police, telling them that Lorenzo had been physically and sexually abusive throughout their entire marriage. This time, the system responded with a fine and a forced divorce, but Lorenzo was essentially free to find new victims. In February 1974, he was arrested for raping a 25-year-old exotic dancer who identified him from a photograph. But yet again, the charges were dropped. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it. Lorenzo Gilliard was a dangerous predator who had learned to work within the system's weaknesses, finding ways to escape consequences while escalating his violence against women. What made Lorenzo particularly dangerous wasn't just his propensity for violence, but his ability to blend into normal society while harboring such dark impulses. After serving time for child molestation, a conviction that should have marked him as a clear danger to the community, he managed to secure employment with a trash collection company. The irony wasn't lost on those who would later study his case. Here was a man whose job involved collecting and disposing of society's refuse, while secretly turning women into refuse himself. The killing began in earnest in 1977 with 17-year-old Stacy L. Swafford, who was last seen alive on April 10th. Her body was discovered a week later in a vacant lot, bearing the signs of suffocation that would become Lorenzo's preferred method of killing. But Stacy was just the beginning of a reign of terror that would continue for 16 years, claiming victims whose ages ranged from 15 to 36, almost all of them women working in prostitution who had been rendered invisible by a society that preferred not to acknowledge their existence. The victims shared disturbing similarities that revealed the calculated nature of Lorenzo's predatory behavior. They were all found shoeless, their bodies dumped in secluded locations around Kansas City, landfills, snowdrifts, abandoned buildings, vacant lots, and parking areas where they might remain undiscovered for days or weeks. Most had cloth or paper towels stuffed into their mouths, a detail that spoke to both the intimate nature of their final moments and Lorenzo's need to silence their voices, even in death. The ligature marks around their necks told the story of their final struggle, while the evidence of sexual assault revealed the true nature of their encounter with their killer. Lorenzo's methodology was as chilling as it was effective. He would target women who were vulnerable, often sex workers who operated in the margins of society, where their disappearances might not immediately trigger intensive police investigations. He would approach them as a customer, someone seeking their services, in what should have been a routine transaction. But once he had them isolated, once he had them in a position where they couldn't escape or call for help, he would reveal his true nature. After sexually assaulting them, he would strangle them to death using whatever was available: their own clothing, nylon stockings, laces, wire, or simply his bare hands. The strangling wasn't just a method of murder, it was an expression of his need to exercise complete control over his victims in their final moments. Strangulation is an intimate form of killing, requiring the killer to be close to his victim, to watch the life drain from their eyes, to feel their struggle weaken and finally cease. For Lorenzo, this wasn't just about ending a life. It was about experiencing the ultimate expression of power over another human being. What made his crimes particularly heinous was the deliberate way he selected victims from society's most marginalized populations. These weren't random killings. They were calculated attacks on women who had been rendered vulnerable by circumstance, addiction, poverty, and societal indifference. Sex workers in the 1980s and early 1990s operated in a world where violence was an accepted occupational hazard, where police investigations into their murders often lacked the intensity reserved for victims from more privileged backgrounds. The investigation into what would eventually be recognized as the work of a serial killer was hampered by these very prejudices. Individual murders were often classified as so isolated incidents, the work of different perpetrators, or simply the inevitable result of dangerous lifestyles. It wasn't until 1994 that police began to forensically link some of the murders to each other, recognizing patterns that suggested the work of a single killer. But by then, Lorenzo had already claimed at least 13 lives and had essentially stopped killing, making him even more difficult to identify and apprehend. The break in the case came not from brilliant detective work or psychological profiling, but from advances in DNA technology and a federal grant that allowed Kansas City police to re-examine cold cases using modern forensic methods. In 2001, the Kansas City Police Department received a multi-million-dollar federal grant specifically aimed at applying new DNA technology to unsolved cases. This funding allowed investigators to take another look at evidence that had been sitting in storage for years, samples that had been collected but never properly analyzed due to the limitations of 1980s forensic science. The key piece of evidence turned out to be a blood sample that had been collected from Lorenzo during a 1987 investigation into the murder of Sheila Ingold. At the time, Lorenzo had been considered a suspect because Ingold's body was found inside an abandoned van that he had pretended to be interested in buying. But without the DNA technology to definitively link him to the crime, investigators had been forced to let him go. That blood sample, stored in a freezer for more than 15 years, would eventually become the thread that unraveled his entire web of murders. In 2003, police scientists began an intensive DNA testing marathon, working overtime nights and weekends to process evidence from 85 cold cases that showed investigative promise. Over 13 months, they amassed 2,500 hours of overtime work, systematically comparing DNA profiles from unsolved murders spanning decades. The breakthrough came in April 2004 when DNA extracted from hair and semen found on multiple victims was matched to a single profile, and that profile belonged to Lorenzo Gilliard. The revelation that a single killer was responsible for so many deaths sent shockwaves through the Kansas City Police Department and the community at large. Investigators realized they were dealing with one of the most prolific serial killers in Missouri history, a man who had been hiding in plain sight for decades while systematically murdering women across the city. The case quickly became the focus of a task force dedicated to building an airtight prosecution that would finally bring Lorenzo to justice. Police began surveillance of Lorenzo on April 12, 2004, when the DNA match was confirmed. For 5 days, they watched him maintain his routine, going to work early, coming home early, spending most of his time inside his house on Kenwood Avenue. To observers, he appeared to be living an utterly normal life, the kind of quiet existence that would never attract suspicion. There was nothing in his behavior that suggested he was a man who had once terrorized an entire city, nothing that revealed the monster hiding behind the facade of respectability. But as officers continued their surveillance on the evening of April 16th, they became concerned that Lorenzo had detected their presence. Whether through some predatory instinct or simple paranoia, he seemed to sense that he was being watched. Rather than risk losing him or allowing him to potentially harm another victim, police made the decision to arrest him immediately. On April 16th, 2004, Lorenzo Gilliard was taken into custody at his home, ending a killing spree that had lasted 16 years and claiming at least 13 lives. The arrest of Lorenzo Gilliard marked the end of one of Kansas City's most notorious serial killer cases, but it also raised uncomfortable questions about how such a prolific killer had managed to operate undetected for so long. The answer lay in the intersection of societal prejudice, investigative limitations, and Lorenzo's own cunning ability to select victims whose deaths wouldn't trigger the kind of intensive investigation reserved for more privileged members of society. Lorenzo was initially charged with 12 counts of first-degree murder, but the prosecution faced the challenge of building cases based on evidence that was decades old. In January 2007, his legal team negotiated a deal with the Jackson County Attorney's Office that would spare him the death penalty in exchange for agreeing to a bench trial, a proceeding where his fate would be decided by a judge alone rather than a jury. This arrangement allowed both sides to avoid the unpredictability of a jury trial while ensuring that Lorenzo would face appropriate consequences for his crimes. The trial began in March 2007, with prosecutors presenting DNA evidence that conclusively linked Lorenzo to 6 murders: Catherine Berry, 34, Naomi Kelly, 23, Ann Barnes, 36, Kelly A. Ford, 20, Sheila Ingold, 36, and Carmeline Hibbs, 30. Throughout the 12-day proceeding, forensic experts testified about genetic matches found on victims' bodies and clothing, while family members of the victims provided heart-wrenching testimony about the impact of their losses. Lorenzo maintained his innocence throughout the trial, a stance he would continue to hold even decades later. In his mind, perhaps, he had simply been a customer of these women, someone who had paid for services and left them alive and well. The ability of serial killers to compartmentalize their actions, to create alternative narratives that allow them to maintain psychological equilibrium, is one of the most disturbing aspects of their psychology. Lorenzo had convinced himself that he was not a killer, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. On March 16, 2007, Lorenzo Gilliard was convicted of 6 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The judge who pronounced the sentence noted that it was the only appropriate punishment for someone who had caused such devastating harm to so many families and to the community as a whole. At 56 years old, Lorenzo would spend the remainder of his life behind bars, never again able to harm another woman. But the conviction of Lorenzo Gilliard represented more than just justice for his victims. It highlighted the systemic failures that had allowed him to operate for so long. The women he killed were not faceless statistics. They were daughters, mothers, sisters, and friends who had been failed by a society that considered their lives less valuable than others. Their involvement in sex work, often driven by addiction, poverty, or desperation, had made them invisible to law enforcement and the broader community until it was too late. The case also demonstrated The crucial importance of advances in forensic science, particularly DNA technology, in solving cold cases and bringing killers to justice. Without the federal grant that funded the DNA testing marathon, Lorenzo might never have been identified as the Kansas City Strangler. His crimes might have remained a collection of unsolved murders, his victims denied the justice they deserved, and the community left wondering whether their killer was still among them. Lorenzo Gilliard currently serves his life sentence at the Crossroads Correctional Center in Cameron, Missouri, where he will remain for the rest of his natural life. In 2018, he was featured in an episode of Serial Killer with Piers Morgan, where he continued to maintain his innocence despite the overwhelming evidence against him. During the interview, he demonstrated the same manipulative personality that had allowed him to evade justice for so long, attempting to control the narrative and present himself as a victim of circumstance rather than a predator who had terrorized Kansas City for 16 years. The psychological profile of Lorenzo Gilliard reveals a man whose capacity for violence was matched only by his ability to compartmentalize and rationalize his actions. Unlike some serial killers who are driven by obvious mental illness or traumatic brain injuries, Lorenzo appeared to be fully aware of his actions and their consequences. His crimes were not the result of momentary breaks from reality. They were calculated acts of violence against vulnerable women, carried out with the methodical precision of someone who understood exactly what he was doing. His family background provided some context for his criminal behavior, with multiple family members involved in serious violent crimes. But millions of people grow up in dysfunctional families without becoming serial killers. What made Lorenzo different was his particular combination of predatory instincts, lack of empathy, and ability to manipulate social and legal systems to his advantage. He had learned early in life that he could escape consequences for his actions through charm, manipulation, and careful victim selection. The case of Lorenzo Gilliard serves as a reminder that monsters don't always look like monsters. They don't announce themselves with obvious signs of mental illness or social dysfunction. Sometimes they look like reliable employees, quiet neighbors, and unremarkable men who blend seamlessly into the fabric of ordinary life. The most dangerous predators are often those who have learned to hide their true nature behind carefully constructed facades of normalcy. For the families of Lorenzo's victims, his conviction brought a measure of closure but could never truly compensate for their losses. These women had been robbed not just of their lives, but of their dignity, their potential, and their connections to the people who loved them. Their deaths had gone unnoticed by much of society, their cases relegated to low priority status because of who they were and how they lived. The conviction of their killer was the acknowledgement that their lives had mattered, that their deaths demanded justice regardless of their circumstances. The Kansas City Strangler case also highlighted the importance of treating all victims with equal dignity and ensuring that investigations into their deaths receive appropriate resources and attention. The systemic biases that allowed Lorenzo to operate for so long continue to affect law enforcement's response to crimes against marginalized populations. Sex workers, drug users, homeless individuals, and others living on society's margins remain vulnerable to predators who understand that their victims will not be missed or that their cases will not receive intensive investigation. Today, Lorenzo Gilliard remains in prison, a 73-year-old man whose legacy is measured in the lives he destroyed rather than any positive contribution he might have made to society. He represents the dark truth that evil can lurk behind the most ordinary facades, that predators can thrive in plain sight when society chooses not to see or protect its most vulnerable members. The women whose lives he stole, Stacy Swafford, Gwendolyn Kazine, Margaret Miller, Debbie Blevins, Catherine Barry, Naomi Kelly, Ann Barnes, Kelly Ford, Angela Mayhew, Sheila Ingold, Carmeline Hibbs, Helga Kruger, and Connie Luther deserved better than the circumstances that made them vulnerable to his predations. They deserved a society that valued their safety, investigations that took their deaths seriously, and justice that came swiftly rather than decades later through advances in DNA technology. The story of Lorenzo Gilliard is ultimately a story about the value we place on human life and the responsibility we bear for protecting the most vulnerable among us. It's a reminder that justice delayed is often justice denied, and that predators will continue to thrive in the shadows as long as society allows certain lives to be treated as disposable. His crimes may have ended with his arrest in 2004, but the lessons of his case continue to resonate today, demanding that we do better in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. In the end, Lorenzo Jerome Gilliard Jr. was not the reliable employee or quiet neighbor that people thought they knew. He was a predator who had learned to exploit societal indifference and systemic failures to pursue his dark compulsions for over 16 years. His conviction brought an end to one of the most prolific killing sprees in Missouri history, but it came at a cost measured in the lives of 13 women who deserved protection they never received and justice that came far too late. In the summer of 2005, in a Denny's restaurant in Coeur d'Alene, Idaho, a waitress recognized a face from the news. An 8-year-old girl sitting across from a man in a booth. A girl who had been missing for 47 days. A girl whose entire family had been slaughtered in their own home. The man with her was Joseph Edward Duncan III, and his story is one of calculated evil spanning decades. Joseph Edward Duncan III was born on February 25, 1963, at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. His father was in the Army, so the family moved constantly, never staying in one place long enough for young Joseph to form lasting connections. They bounced from city to city, state to state, even overseas, until finally settling in Tacoma, Washington when Joseph was 12. His mother was described as domineering, his father distant. When his parents divorced in 1983, something inside Joseph had already broken. By age 15, Joseph had committed his first recorded sex crime. In 1978, he raped a 9-year-old boy at gunpoint. When authorities finally caught him, they didn't realize they were looking at a monster in the making. He was sent to the Dislin Boys Ranch in Tacoma, where he told a therapist something chilling. He had bound and sexually assaulted 6 boys. He estimated that by the time he was 16, he had raped 13 younger boys. The system failed. It failed those children, and it failed to stop what was coming. In 1980, Duncan kidnapped a 14-year-old boy and raped him at gunpoint. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, but was released on parole in 1994 after serving only 14 years. The parole conditions were simple: no contact with children. Duncan ignored them completely. While on parole, Duncan moved around the Seattle area like a ghost. Authorities now believe he committed multiple murders during this time, including the 1996 deaths of 11-year-old Samieja White and 9-year-old Carmen Cubias, half-sisters who vanished from a Seattle motel and weren't found until nearly 2 years later. Their skeletal remains told a story of violence that would become Duncan's signature. In 1997, while still on parole, Duncan committed another horrific crime. 10-year-old Anthony Martinez was playing in his front yard in Beaumont, California, when a stranger approached, asking for help finding a missing cat. When the boys refused, Duncan grabbed Anthony at knife point and threw him into his vehicle. Anthony's body was found 2 weeks later, nude and partially decomposed. Duncan had tortured him before killing him. That same year, Duncan violated his parole and was sent back to prison. He was released again in 2000, this time moving to Fargo, North Dakota. The cycle was starting again. By 2005, Duncan was a federal fugitive. He had skipped bail on charges of molesting 2 boys at a playground in Minnesota. He was desperate, angry, and looking for an outlet for his rage. That's when he spotted something that would change everything. Driving west on Interstate 90 through the Idaho Panhandle, Duncan saw 2 children playing in their swimsuits in the yard of a home near Wolf Lodge Bay. He pulled off the road and began watching. For days, he surveilled the Groween family home, using night vision goggles to study their routines, their vulnerabilities. He was hunting. The Groween family seemed perfect from the outside. Brenda Groen, 40 years old, was living with her boyfriend, Mark McKenzie, and her 3 children, 13-year-old Slade, 9-year-old Dylan, and 8-year-old Shasta. They were a blended family trying to make it work in rural Idaho. They had no idea that a predator was watching their every move. On the night of May 15th, 2005, Duncan made his move. Armed with zip ties, duct tape, and a hammer, he crept into the Groween home under cover of darkness. Shasta would later tell investigators what happened next. Her mother woke them up, saying someone was in the house. When they went to the living room, they saw Duncan wearing black gloves and holding a gun. What followed was a massacre. Duncan bound Brenda Groen, Mark McKenzie, and 13-year-old Slade with zip ties, then beat them to death with a hammer. One by one, he bludgeoned them until they stopped moving. The violence was so brutal that investigators struggled to process the scene. But Duncan wasn't finished. He took Dylan and Shasta, binding their hands and feet, and carried them outside to a stolen red Jeep Cherokee. As he drove away with the children, 3 people lay dead in their own home, their blood soaking into the floor. Duncan drove the children deep into the Lolo National Forest in Montana to a remote campsite where no one would hear their screams. For 47 days, he held them captive. He sexually abused both children repeatedly. He filmed his crimes, creating evidence of his depravity that would later horrify even seasoned investigators. Throughout their captivity, Duncan played psychological games with the children. He told them their family was dead. He described in detail how he had killed them. He made them believe they would never escape, that this nightmare was their new reality. Dylan tried to protect his little sister. Shasta would later recall how her brother attempted to shield her from the worst of Duncan's abuse. but Duncan grew tired of the boy's defiance. On July 4th weekend, at that remote campsite in Montana, Duncan took Dylan away from the camp. He held a sawed-off 12-gauge shotgun to the 9-year-old's head and pulled the trigger. Shasta was now alone with her family's killer. Duncan's plan was to take Shasta to North Dakota to meet his family to continue the nightmare indefinitely. But first, he wanted to return to Coeur d'Alene, to the scene of his crimes. On July 2nd, 2005, he walked into a Denny's restaurant with Shasta, perhaps testing whether anyone would recognize her. It was the mistake that ended his reign of terror. A waitress, a manager, and 2 customers immediately recognized the little girl from media reports. For 47 days, her face had been on television screens across the nation. An AMBER alert had mobilized hundreds of law enforcement officers and volunteers in the largest criminal investigation in Kootenai County history. The restaurant staff called police and positioned themselves to prevent Duncan from leaving. When officers arrived, they found Duncan sitting calmly with Shasta, showing no signs of panic or remorse. When they arrested him, he looked at them and said, "I'm the one you're looking for. I've done this before." Shasta was alive, but profoundly traumatized. Dylan's remains were found days later at the Montana campsite where Duncan had murdered him. The FBI recovered video evidence of Duncan's crimes against the children, footage so disturbing that jurors were offered counseling just to cope with what they had seen. Duncan's confessions revealed the scope of his crimes. He admitted not only to the Groween family murders, but to the deaths of Anthony Martinez, Samiejo White, and Carmen Cubias. Investigators suspected there were more victims, cases that would never be solved because Duncan took those secrets with him. In court, Duncan was calm, articulate, even cooperative. He pleaded guilty to 10 federal counts related to the Groween family murders. He was sentenced to death in 2008, but even on death row, he continued to manipulate, maintaining a blog through intermediaries and granting interviews where he showed no remorse for his crimes. Duncan waived his right to appeal his death sentence, claiming he wanted to die. But his attorneys fought for years to overturn his conviction, prolonging the agony for the victims' families. The legal battles continued until 2019, when his final appeal was denied. Joseph Edward Duncan III died on March 28, 2021, of brain cancer while on death row. He was 58 years old. He never faced execution for his crimes, but death found him anyway. Shasta Groen survived. Today, she is a mother herself, trying to rebuild a life shattered by unimaginable trauma. She has spoken publicly about her experience, hoping to help other victims of violence. Her courage in the face of such horror stands as a testament to human resilience. The Wolf Lodge home, where the Groween family was murdered, was demolished in 2008. The site stands empty now, overgrown with weeds, but the memory of what happened there remains. It serves as a reminder that evil can strike anywhere, anytime, and that the monsters we fear most often hide in plain sight. Duncan's case exposed critical failures in the criminal justice system. How does a violent sexual predator get released on parole twice? How does someone with his history of child abuse continue to find new victims? These questions haunt law enforcement and policymakers to this day. The story of Joseph Edward Duncan III is one of systematic failure and unspeakable evil. It's the story of a broken system that repeatedly failed to protect children from a known predator. It's the story of a family destroyed by a man who had already proven, again and again, that he could not be rehabilitated. But it's also the story of Shasta Groan's survival, of a community that never stopped searching, and of the dedication of law enforcement officers who worked tirelessly to bring a monster to justice. In the end, Duncan's reign of terror lasted decades, but it finally came to an end in a Denny's restaurant where alert citizens refused to let evil win. Joseph Edward Duncan III is gone now, but the scars he left behind remain. His victims' families still carry the weight of their loss. The investigators who worked his cases still struggle with the horrors they witnessed. And somewhere in Idaho, an empty lot stands where a family once lived, loved, and died at the hands of a man who should never have been free to hurt anyone again. The nightmare at Wolf Lodge is over, but its lessons echo on. Vigilance matters, systems fail, and sometimes the only thing standing between evil and innocence is an alert waitress in a 24-hour diner who refuses to look the other way.